The morning sun barely reached the ground in Millstone, Texas, casting long shadows over the grandest building in town, Summit First National Bank. Before we continue the story, comment what city you're watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you enjoy stories like this. Its glass doors gleamed, the polished brass handle reflecting the pride of an entire town. The kind of place where suits and ties were the uniform, and wealth was worn like a badge of honor. But today, something was different. An old man, weathered, stooped, and bent with the weight of a life far longer than most could imagine, walked into that bank. Clutched in his calloused hands was a sack, worn and frayed at the edges, as though it had seen decades of hardship. He shuffled slowly, one foot in front of the other, dragging the sack behind him, as though it was the only thing in the world he could trust. The people in the lobby barely spared him a glance. They were busy. The hustle and bustle of money being counted, of deals being struck, of lives being shaped by transactions. And there he was, just an old man, a relic from another time, probably looking for a handout. The bank staff didn't waste a second to dismiss him. "Can I help you, sir?" asked the receptionist, her voice flat, uninterested. The others barely looked up. "I need to speak to the manager," he rasped, his voice rough like gravel, worn out by years of stories untold. They laughed. A brief, polite chuckle. Perhaps it was his age, the disheveled look of him. Or maybe it was the sack. What could be in it? Certainly nothing worth paying attention to. "You'll have to wait," the receptionist said, not even attempting to hide her disdain. "But I'm sure you'll be fine. No one's going to steal your spot." The old man did not respond. He didn't need to. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes scanning the room, the hum of the bank's machinery drowning out the quiet tension that seemed to linger in the air. What happened next shattered everything. What they didn't know, couldn't even begin to imagine, was that the man they had laughed at, dismissed, was no ordinary old man. He wasn't a beggar. He wasn't there for charity. In his hands, wrapped tightly inside that sack, was something that would change the fate of Millstone forever. Minutes passed. The receptionist turned away, dismissing him like everyone else. But the old man didn't leave. Instead, the doors of the bank opened once more, and a figure entered. A figure that would soon become the talk of the entire state of Texas. The doors swung wide, and a man in a sharp suit, Braylon Meeks, the VP of Summit First National Bank, walked toward the counter. The room went quiet for a moment. He was used to that kind of respect, the kind that comes with power, with money, with influence. "Is there a problem here?" Braylon asked, eyeing the old man with the sack. His voice was cold, almost mocking. "No, no problem," the receptionist stammered. "Just an old man with a sack." But Braylon wasn't paying attention. His eyes were locked on the sack. "You know," he said with a grin, "I've never seen anyone so colorful in this place." "What's in the sack, old man?" The bank employees shifted uneasily. The old man finally lifted the sack, his movement slow but deliberate. He dropped it onto the polished marble counter with a thud that seemed to echo throughout the room. "It's time to pay what's owed," he said, his voice clear now, no longer shaky. Braylon smirked, clearly expecting some kind of joke, some ridiculous story about how this old man was here to make a scene. He reached forward and yanked the sack open. Inside was not what anyone could have guessed. It wasn't full of cash. It wasn't full of anything they expected. It was a yellowing, brittle piece of paper. A single document, old and frayed, sealed tightly with a piece of string. Braylon didn't even bother to look at it. Without a second thought, he tore it in half, tossing it onto the counter. "Next," he called out, his tone mocking, confident that the old man had no real claim to anything. But the room fell silent. No one knew what was coming. No one knew what that piece of paper was, what it meant, or how it would turn the tide in a way that no one could have anticipated. What happened next? What followed that moment of disbelief would change everything. Lives would be ruined. Reputations destroyed. But through it all, one undeniable truth would stand tall, and it wasn't what they expected. Not at all. As we dive into the story, if you believe everyone should be treated with respect, no matter what their color and condition is, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. God sees everything. You see, that old man, he wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past. He wasn't some old man stumbling into a bank by accident. He had been there long before any of them. And what they had just dismissed as nothing more than an old piece of paper. It held power. Power that none of them could imagine. The document was real. It was the original deed to Summit First National Bank. And the man with the sack? He owned it. In the heart of Millstone, Texas, things moved at a slower pace. People knew each other by name. Neighbors were close-knit, and change came in small, hesitant steps. It was the kind of town where the old ways were valued above all else, where men worked hard, women kept their homes, and the idea of wealth was tied not to what you owned, but how you held yourself in front of others. Summit First National Bank was the centerpiece of Millstone's sense of pride, its towering walls a symbol of success, status, and influence in a town where few dared to challenge the status quo. But that was not the life Ezekiel Dawson knew. Zeke, as everyone called him, had lived in Millstone for nearly his entire life. But he wasn't a man of wealth or status. No, Zeke was something different, something that stood outside the rigid framework of the town's society. He was an 82-year-old war veteran, his face lined with the marks of time, his hands rough from years of hard labor. He had worked construction for decades, building the foundations of many of Millstone's structures, including the very bank that would one day claim to own everything he had. He didn't have much. A modest trailer on the outskirts of town, perched on the edge of a dusty road, was his home. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, a rusted roof, and old tires scattered around the yard. But it was his, and it had been paid for with the sweat of his brow. Zeke had never cared for luxuries. He had always lived simply, always believed in the idea that the less you owned, the freer you were. His greatest treasures were not material. They were his memories, his faith, and the hope that one day, everything he had worked for would be acknowledged. Every morning, long before the sun had fully risen, Zeke would walk out to a cedar tree in his front yard. There, he'd kneel in the dirt and pray, not for riches, not for success, but for peace, for strength, and for the wisdom to know how to live his life with integrity. The world around him may have been growing more complicated, but Zeke knew the truth. God sees everything, and that was enough. His life wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his years, of the loneliness that had followed the passing of his wife, seemed too much to bear. But there was always that cedar tree, always the quiet rhythm of his prayers, always the reminder that he wasn't truly alone. Yet, in a town like Millstone, things weren't always as simple as they seemed. Enter Braylon Meeks. Braylon was the vice president of Summit First National Bank, and to say that he was a man of pride would be an understatement. He was young, ambitious, and brash, everything Zeke had never cared to be. Braylon walked with the kind of swagger that came from being raised in privilege, the kind of confidence that had been cultivated in the sterile environment of boardrooms and luxury cars. He was the face of Millstone's banking elite, a man who knew how to make deals, how to get what he wanted, and how to look down on those he considered beneath him. He was the kind of man who didn't see Zeke. To him, Zeke was nothing more than another relic from the past, a poor, forgotten soul who had been left behind in the fast-paced world of finance and power. Braylon didn't know Zeke's story. He didn't know that the man who shuffled around in worn-out boots had built the very foundations of this town. He didn't know that Zeke had once been promised something more, a promise made by the original founders of Summit First National Bank, a promise that Zeke would one day share in the ownership of the institution he had helped create. But those promises had been broken, forgotten, and swept away like dust under the rug. No one in Millstone, least of all Braylon, had ever considered that Zeke might have a claim to anything. But Zeke didn't speak of it. He didn't flaunt his knowledge or his rights. Instead, he kept his secret locked away, hidden in a sack that he carried with him everywhere. It was an old sack, heavy and worn, held together by 3 clasps that only Zeke could open. He never showed anyone what was inside. He never needed to. In his heart, he knew that the day would come when it would be revealed, when the truth would be undeniable, when the world would see who he truly was. No one, not even Braylon, knew the power that lay within that sack. It wasn't just a collection of documents, papers, and signatures. It was the key to everything. The key to the life Zeke had been promised, the life that had been stolen from him. And now, the day had come. The day when all the false assumptions, all the mockery, all the judgment and scorn would be answered, not with anger, not with violence, but with truth. And truth, as Zeke knew well, always had a way of revealing itself. But Braylon didn't know that yet. Not even close. Zeke didn't care what Braylon thought of him. He didn't care about the snide remarks or the dismissal from the bank employees. He wasn't there to fight for respect. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for justice. What would you do if someone proclaimed to own your bank? Think about it. What if the very person you had looked down on, dismissed, and forgotten was the one who held the keys to everything you thought you owned? What if the man who had been ignored for so long was the one who held the truth? Zeke Dawson wasn't just a forgotten old man. He was a man who had built this town, and the time had come for the world to recognize what had always been his. But they didn't see it coming. Not yet. The following Monday, the sun barely climbed above the horizon when Zeke Dawson made his way to Summit First National Bank. It wasn't like any other morning for him. He wasn't there to make a deposit, to take out a loan, or to ask for charity. No, this time, Zeke had a purpose. The kind of purpose that cannot be ignored, no matter how many people try to look the other way. The bank's grand lobby was bustling with activity as Zeke walked in. The polished floors shone under the overhead lights, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. But for Zeke, the usual hum of the place was just background noise. His eyes were focused, his steps deliberate, as though he had been walking this path for years, though in reality, this was the first time he had ever stepped foot inside. As Zeke shuffled towards the counter, the staff behind the desks paused. A few exchanged puzzled looks. The receptionist's eyebrows furrowed as she saw the old man approach. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to mask the disdain in her voice. Zeke didn't look at her. Instead, he said with quiet authority, "I need to speak with the highest-ranking manager here." A silence fell over the room. Those who were working on their computers stopped typing. The few clients in the lobby turned their heads. No one had ever asked to speak to the highest-ranking manager. In a place like this, it wasn't done. The receptionist hesitated. She glanced at her coworkers, unsure how to respond. In a moment, the bank's security guard, a towering figure with broad shoulders and a stern face, made his way over. He towered over Zeke, his uniform pressing tight against his large frame. "Sir," the security guard said, his tone clipped. "If you're not here to do business, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Zeke didn't flinch. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the yellowing, fragile document. The one he had carried with him for years, the one he had never shown to anyone. With a slow, deliberate motion, he placed it on the counter in front of the receptionist. "I'm here to do business," Zeke said, his voice low but clear. "And this is my business." The receptionist glanced at the document, her eyes widening slightly. She didn't know what it was, but she could tell it wasn't just any piece of paper. There was something about it, something that spoke of years, of history, of something far deeper than the polished veneer of the bank. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's attitude shifted based on appearances? Share your experiences in the comments below and click on the subscribe button. Without a word, she picked it up, studying it carefully, and then turned toward the security guard. The guard looked at the document, then at Zeke, and in that moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But still, he reached for his radio, as if preparing to escort the old man out. Before he could speak, Braylon Meeks, the vice president of Summit First National Bank, walked into the lobby. His gaze swept the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw the commotion. When his gaze landed on Zeke, his lips curled into a smirk. He had been expecting some sort of nuisance. Another person asking for a loan, perhaps, or maybe a complaint. Well, Braylon said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he approached the counter. "What do we have here?" "The man who thinks he owns the bank." The staff behind him laughed, though there was an edge of nervousness in their voices. Zeke didn't flinch. He had seen this look before. The look of someone who thought they knew everything, who assumed their position, made them untouchable. Braylon took a few steps forward, the smirk still on his face. He grabbed the document from the receptionist's hands, holding it up like it was a crumpled piece of trash. "What's this, some kind of joke?" Braylon sneered, his tone mocking. "You expect me to take this seriously?" He didn't even glance at it. With a flick of his wrist, Braylon tore the document in half, the paper ripping with a sound that seemed to echo in the now silent room. The receptionist gasped, her eyes wide. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his large frame seemingly shrinking in the wake of what had just happened. The staff watched in stunned silence, unsure what to make of it. Zeke stood motionless, his eyes never leaving Braylon's face. But Braylon's cocky grin faltered for a split second. He had expected to put the old man in his place, to make him feel small, insignificant. But the air in the room had shifted. There was something unsettling about the way Zeke stood there, unbothered. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't waver. He simply waited. Braylon laughed, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "I'm sorry, old man. You must have gotten the wrong idea. You're wasting my time." But Zeke didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had already said everything he needed to say with that one action. The torn document, now laying in pieces on the counter, was not the end. It was just the beginning. There was a long silence, and in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The man who everyone thought was nothing more than a poor old fool had just revealed that he wasn't just some nobody. He wasn't there to beg. He wasn't there to be dismissed. He had just given them a glimpse of something far greater than they could comprehend. What would you do if you noticed this kind of behavior? Would you step in or stay quiet? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The days that followed were a blur of mockery and disbelief. Zeke's name spread like wildfire through the town of Millstone. The local news stations couldn't get enough of the story. A frail old man walks into a well-established bank, claiming ownership. It was too ridiculous, too unbelievable. The headlines played with the narrative, teasing Zeke's dignity for entertainment, calling him a delusional veteran and a wandering fool. The mockery was sharp, cutting into the already fragile reputation of an old man who had spent decades in silence. But behind the ridicule, the story was far from over. As the media circus unfolded, something stirred quietly behind the scenes. For years, Zeke had kept to the shadows of Millstone. His trailer on the edge of town, isolated from the world that looked down on him, seemed to be his only sanctuary. But Zeke had never been just another forgotten soul. No, he had a secret, one that no one, least of all the high-rise bankers of Summit First National, could have ever predicted. Zeke was not just a victim of forgotten promises. He was a man who had built the very foundation of Summit Bank, brick by brick, from the ground up. Flashbacks began to pull back the veil of Zeke's past. The year was 1962. A young Zeke, full of life and ambition, had worked tirelessly as a construction foreman, overseeing the building of Summit First National Bank. It wasn't just a job for him, it was a promise. Zeke had been promised equity shares, a piece of the very institution he helped to create, by the original founders, men who spoke with the conviction of men who meant what they said. Those men had shaken his hand, given him their word. He'd never asked for anything else. His work had been his payment. But when the bank had finally opened its doors, those promises had vanished like smoke in the wind. The original founders had passed, and with them, the agreement. No equity shares. No ownership rights. Zeke's work was forgotten, his sweat and blood erased from the pages of history. The dream of owning a piece of Summit Bank had slipped through his fingers. The torn document that Zeke had handed over that fateful morning was not just some irrelevant piece of paper. It was the original deed of ownership, a signed certificate, a token of the promise he had kept alive in his heart for more than half a century. The weight of those papers was more than just ink and signatures. It was the culmination of a life's work, a promise unkept. But none of that mattered to Braylon Meeks or the bank's board members. Their laughter was louder than ever. They dismissed Zeke like a ghost, someone not worth their time or respect. They saw only an old man with a sack. They saw weakness, frailty. Is this what it's come to? Braylon sneered during a public meeting. This man is claiming to own a bank he's never done a day's work for, and we're supposed to entertain this nonsense? Let's move on. The board nodded in agreement. To them, Zeke was a joke. His claims were absurd, laughable. There was no history here, just a rambling old man clinging to fantasies. But amidst the laughter and the mockery, a quiet rebellion was taking root. A young woman named Rosa James, a junior employee at Summit Bank, had been quietly listening. Rosa was a soft-spoken, meticulous woman who believed in doing things right, no matter the cost. She wasn't like the others who scoffed at Zeke. Something about his presence, his conviction, moved her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone cared to see. She couldn't just let the matter rest. Not when she felt something deeper at play. So, she began to dig. Rosa poured through the bank's records, spending hours in the dusty archives. She sifted through old documents, long-forgotten blueprints, and handwritten ledgers that no one had bothered to examine in decades. It was exhausting work, tedious, and often frustrating. But as the hours turned into days, Rosa's persistence began to bear fruit. At first, she uncovered documents that confirmed Zeke's initial claims. There were references to a construction deal, an agreement that Zeke had indeed played a critical role in building the bank. But that wasn't enough. She needed proof. Something concrete, undeniable. Then, as she was about to give up, something caught her eye. A deed to a piece of land. The name on the document sent a chill down her spine. It was Zeke's late wife's name. Rosa froze. She picked up the deed, her hands trembling as she read the details. The land deed was registered to Zeke's wife, Madeline Dawson, and listed under Summit Bank's ownership. The document wasn't just a name. It was a connection, a tie between Zeke's past and the bank's holdings. How had this slipped through the cracks? Rosa didn't know, but she knew this was the key. The ties between Zeke, his wife, and the bank were undeniable. However, Rosa's discovery came at a price. As she delved deeper into the records, she began to receive threats. It started with a few cryptic messages slipped under her office door. Then, someone began to follow her after work. Rosa's life was being invaded, and she could feel the walls closing in. One evening, she received a phone call at home. The voice on the other end was cold, menacing. "You're digging into something you shouldn't, Rosa. Stop before it gets worse. You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Rosa wasn't backing down. She had seen enough. She had found the truth. And there was no way she was going to let a corrupt system cover up Zeke's story. As the threats escalated, Rosa made a decision. She would take her findings to the one person who had been wronged, the one person who deserved the truth. Zeke Dawson. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button, ABD comment. Justice is coming. Let's see how many people believe Zeke deserves the truth. Because the road to redemption was just beginning, and no one, not even the might of Summit Bank, could stop it. The clock had been ticking down for weeks. Summit First National Bank was about to undergo a significant transformation. Braylon Meeks, the bank's arrogant vice president, had clawed his way to the top. All the manipulation, the disregard for others, it had paid off. Braylon was on the verge of being crowned the new CEO of Summit Bank. The ceremony had been meticulously planned, an opulent affair to celebrate his triumph. Braylon couldn't wait to stand in front of the crowd, basking in the glow of his conquest. It was the culmination of everything he'd worked for, and his ego couldn't have been bigger. In his mind, no one would dare challenge him now. The public had all but forgotten about the old man, Zeke Dawson, and the ridiculous claims he had made. Zeke's name was starting to fade from the front pages of the newspaper, replaced by headlines heralding Braylon's imminent rise. Braylon stood at the head of the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, making small talk with the bank's board members, the town's elite, the media. Everything felt like it was falling into place. But what Braylon didn't know was that the storm was about to hit. The room fell silent. The door swung open with a creak, and all eyes turned. Standing in the doorway was Zeke Dawson, his weathered face calm but resolute. The old man, dressed in his usual plain clothes, walked slowly, deliberately into the grand hall. There was no fanfare, no entourage, just Zeke. He carried the sack. That same dusty, heavy sack he'd kept with him for years. The one no one dared ask about. The one that had sparked so many questions and scornful remarks. He walked to the center of the room and, without saying a word, placed the sack on the polished wood table. The sack hit with a thud that echoed through the room, as if the weight of it was too much to ignore. Braylon, sensing a disturbance, turned to sneer, but his eyes widened when Zeke slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was not a tattered old relic, but the original founding charter of Summit First National Bank, signed by the original founders in 1854. The weight of that document alone was enough to make every jaw in the room tighten. But that wasn't all. Beside the charter lay a stack of land transfer documents, land that was originally designated as part of the bank's property, but had never been properly recorded. There, in the pile, was a sealed letter, yellowed with age, written in the careful script of the founder himself. Zeke's hands trembled slightly as he carefully held up the letter for all to see. This, Zeke said, his voice steady but filled with decades of emotion, was the agreement. The founder's words. My share. My ownership stake. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Braylon's face shifted from disbelief to contempt. He let out a mocking laugh. Is this some kind of joke, Zeke? He scoffed, his voice laced with arrogance. These papers mean nothing. We've already been through this. But as Braylon moved to dismiss the evidence, something unexpected happened. The doors swung open once more. This time, a woman stepped into the room, tall, authoritative, and unmistakably powerful. She was dressed in the dark robes of a judge, and her gaze was sharp, unwavering. It was Julia Meeks, Braylon's estranged cousin. But she wasn't here for the ceremony. She wasn't here to congratulate anyone. She was here to speak the truth. She strode forward, her eyes locked on Zeke. The documents he holds are legitimate, Julia said, her voice booming through the silent room. I've seen these before. My grandfather, one of the original founders, left specific instructions. Zeke Dawson was promised his stake in this bank. A 40% ownership share. Gasps filled the room. Braylon's face went ashen. His dream of taking over Summit Bank was crumbling before his eyes. Braylon began, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced. How could this be happening? How could everything be falling apart so quickly? Julia turned to face the board of directors, her presence commanding their full attention. I've reviewed the records, the land deeds, the charter, and the letter from my grandfather himself. The evidence is clear. Zeke Dawson is not just some poor old man. He is the rightful owner of 40% of Summit First National Bank. For the first time, the room was on Zeke's side. The board members, who had once laughed at him, were now shifting uneasily in their seats. They had underestimated him, brushed him aside like an irrelevant nobody. Now, they were facing a legal battle they couldn't ignore. Braylon turned to Julia, his voice a low growl. You can't just walk in here and drop this bombshell. This is absurd. I've worked my entire life for this. You're telling me that this man is my co-owner. Julia didn't flinch. I'm telling you the truth. Zeke's claim is real, and it's time for this bank to face its reckoning. The tension in the room was unbearable. The moment that had seemed so impossible just weeks ago had now become undeniable. Zeke was no longer the fool in the dusty sack. He was a man of great power, standing tall with the truth in his hands. The world had shifted. Braylon's dream of becoming CEO was over before it even began. Zeke was about to take his rightful place, if only he chose to. As the board members exchanged uneasy glances, Zeke stood silent. His hands, once trembling with age, were now steady. He had waited for this moment his entire life, but the man he had become was not driven by greed. No, Zeke had spent his life learning the power of faith. And now, his faith was leading him down a path that no one could have foreseen. Zeke could have taken control of the bank. He could have demanded his 40% ownership, but he wasn't driven by the pursuit of wealth. He knew what mattered most: justice, truth, and redemption. But what would he do next? Would he walk away from it all, or would he stake his claim and reclaim what was rightfully his? The clock was ticking, and for the first time, Braylon Meeks wasn't the one with the power. The question remained: would Zeke Dawson take control, or would he let justice speak for itself? What would you do if you were Zeke? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that yet. The battle had only just begun, but already, the full weight of the system came crashing down on Zeke Dawson. What he had once hoped would be a peaceful claim to what was rightfully his was now a nightmare of legal maneuvering, deceit, and pressure. Summit First National Bank, now fully aware of the storm they had unleashed, wasted no time in using their immense power to bury Zeke's claim. They hired the best legal minds money could buy, high-powered attorneys who had a reputation for crushing any opponent who dared challenge the elite. Braylon Meeks, though his public bravado had faltered, was relentless in his pursuit of power. He wasn't about to let some old war veteran steal the future he had fought for. The first attack came not in the form of a legal rebuttal but with an assault on Zeke's very character. The bank's lawyers filed papers to challenge Zeke's mental capacity, arguing that his age and emotional distress had clouded his judgment, making him unfit to even make such a claim. The words stung. Zeke had fought in wars, had seen the worst humanity could offer, and had lived a life of hard work and faith. But here they were, painting him as a senile old man, trying to strip away his dignity. The stress of it all was too much for Zeke. His health, already fragile, began to deteriorate under the immense pressure. He was rushed to the hospital in the dead of night, his heart racing, his breath shallow. What do you think Zeke should do next? Let us know in the comments. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button for more. It was there, in the sterile white room, with the faint hum of machines in the background, that Zeke found himself alone, isolated in his thoughts. As the weight of the world pressed down on him, his eyes closed, and he whispered a prayer so raw, so vulnerable, it seemed to echo through the sterile walls. Lord, I don't want revenge. I just want what's right. His voice cracked. His hands, once steady with purpose, trembled from the weight of it all. Zeke knew that he didn't want to destroy Braylon or the bank, but he also knew that what was right needed to prevail. This wasn't about wealth. This wasn't about control. This was about truth. And Zeke prayed for strength, the strength to see it through, no matter what the cost. The world outside seemed indifferent to his plea, but God had always answered Zeke in the most unexpected of ways. At that moment, when it seemed that Zeke would be crushed under the weight of it all, something changed. Rosa James, the young junior bank employee who had quietly supported Zeke, was no longer willing to stay in the shadows. The more she dug into the bank's past, the more she uncovered. Documents, signatures, and proof of Zeke's rightful ownership were everywhere. But there was something else, something far darker. She had been digging through the vault's records when she discovered the unthinkable. Braylon had destroyed key legal documents. Documents that would have sealed Zeke's claim. She couldn't believe it at first. He had deliberately shredded vital papers that proved Zeke was right all along. The evidence was there, clear and undeniable. Rosa knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and quietly began to record. It wasn't just for Zeke anymore. It was for the truth. It was for the future. She caught Braylon in a quiet moment in his office, speaking to one of his associates, unaware that Rosa was secretly filming the conversation. He casually mentioned how he had taken the initiative to destroy the documents to protect the bank's future. His words were chilling, revealing the depths of his greed and his disregard for justice. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a fight for the soul of the town, for the soul of the bank, and for the soul of every person who had been wronged by power and privilege. The video was a bombshell, and Rosa knew it would change everything. But when she tried to hand it over to Zeke's attorneys, the stakes became even higher. Braylon, ever the manipulator, tried to bribe her, offering her a cushy job, a promise of financial security. He played the game like a master, but Rosa's heart was set. She refused to be bought. She refused to be silenced. The case moved quickly, and soon, all eyes were on Bryant County Courthouse. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial of the century unfolded. Zeke, though frail, stood tall beside his attorneys. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Would the system protect the powerful once again, as it had done so many times before? Would Zeke's story be drowned out by the wealth and influence of the bank? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with people, media, curious onlookers, and members of the community who had heard about Zeke's fight. Rosa sat quietly in the back, her eyes fixed on the proceedings. Zeke's attorneys presented their case, detailing the destruction of legal documents, the historical evidence of Zeke's ownership, and the devastating impact the bank's actions had on him and his family. Then, it was Braylon's turn. He stood in front of the jury, his face a mask of arrogance and disdain. His attorneys tried to discredit Zeke's character, portraying him as a confused, misguided old man. They argued that the torn papers were nothing more than fabrications, desperate attempts by a senile individual to claim something he didn't deserve. But Rosa had the last word. She stood up, taking the stand, her voice steady but filled with conviction. She played the video for the jury, Braylon's own confession, raw and unedited. The room fell into stunned silence as Braylon's words rang out. "I destroyed the documents. It was for the bank's good. Zeke didn't deserve what he was claiming." Gasps filled the room. Braylon's face turned pale. The evidence was irrefutable. His empire was crumbling. As the trial continued, the tension reached a breaking point. Would the jury see the truth for what it was? Would they stand with Zeke? Or would they fall prey to the power and influence of the bank? The stakes had never been higher, and for Zeke, this was the ultimate test. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about ownership of the bank. It was about justice, about doing what was right, no matter the cost. And Zeke had faith that, in the end, truth would prevail. The final challenge had arrived. Would the system stand firm, or would the powerful continue to rule with impunity? What do you think will happen next? Will Zeke get the justice he deserves? Or will the system fail him? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as the jury returned with their verdict. Each juror's face was a mask of emotion, but there was no denying the weight of the moment. Zeke stood, stoic, his heart pounding in his chest, but his faith unwavering. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, called the court to attention. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice carrying the gravity of the situation. The foreman stood and spoke in a clear, resolute voice. "We, the jury, find in favor of Ezekiel Dawson. We award him 40% ownership of Summit First National Bank." A collective gasp filled the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Zeke's eyes, though weary, glistened with something deeper: relief, vindication, and a profound sense of justice. The judge then turned to Braylon Meeks, who had been seated, his face pale, his confidence now shattered. "Mr. Meeks," the judge continued, his voice cold, "you are hereby arrested for fraud, obstruction of justice, and the destruction of key legal documents. You will be taken into custody immediately." Braylon's face twisted in disbelief as the officers moved toward him. His empire had crumbled, and he was no longer the man who could bend the rules in his favor. His arrogance had finally met its match in the quiet resolve of an 82-year-old war veteran. The fall from grace was swift and brutal, and no amount of wealth or status could protect him now. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Zeke stood motionless, the weight of the moment slowly sinking in. He had fought for this. He had prayed for this. But now, all he could feel was peace. It wasn't the victory he had dreamed of. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about justice. It was about what was right. Zeke walked out of the courtroom, his steps slow, deliberate, but humble. He had no need to gloat, no desire for the applause that was sure to follow. As the doors to the courthouse opened, a swarm of reporters rushed forward, microphones and cameras thrusting into his face. Flashbulbs popped, and questions were fired at him from every angle. But Zeke remained silent, his eyes fixed ahead. Finally, One reporter broke through the noise. "Mr. Dawson, what's next for you? How do you feel about winning such a monumental case?" Zeke paused, taking a deep breath. His voice, though quiet, was firm and filled with a deep sense of purpose. "I don't want their praise. I just want to go home and thank Jesus." It wasn't the answer anyone expected, but it was the answer that mattered most. Zeke wasn't in it for the fame or the recognition. His victory wasn't about accolades or fortune. It was about faith, faith in God, faith in what was right, and faith that the truth would come to light, no matter how dark the world seemed. The reporters stood in stunned silence. Some scribbled notes. Others, who had once mocked him, now stood in awe of the man who had just changed the course of history in Millstone, Texas. Zeke didn't need their approval. He had already received what he truly sought, the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been done. In the months that followed, Rosa James became the new vice president of Summit First National Bank. Her promotion was met with much fanfare, but for Rosa, it was about more than just the title. She had been the one to stand by Zeke, the one to uncover the truth, and she had proven that integrity could win over even the most powerful forces. She was a symbol of courage and honesty, and her rise within the bank was a testament to the belief that one person, one act of defiance, could make all the difference. As for Zeke, his life took a turn toward a peaceful retirement. He didn't seek the riches his newfound shares could offer. Instead, he took most of the money and donated it to causes he held dear, veterans who had fought for their country, and single mothers who struggled to make ends meet. His faith had always been his guiding light, and now his generosity became a reflection of that belief. Zeke had no family left. His wife had passed many years ago, and he had never had children of his own. But in his heart, he had always yearned for a family, a sense of belonging. As his final act, Zeke made a decision that would change Rosa's life forever. He left his house, his remaining money, and his shares of the bank to Rosa. In the will, he wrote, "To Rosa James, the daughter I never had." Tears welled up in Rosa's eyes when she read the words. She had never expected this. She had given everything to help Zeke, but she had never asked for anything in return. And yet, here he was, entrusting her with his legacy. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It was about the love and respect they had for one another. It was about faith in something greater than themselves. Zeke Dawson had lived a life that many would consider simple, but his impact was immeasurable. He had fought for what was right, not with anger or bitterness, but with humility and faith. And in the end, he had left behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come. His story was a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely person can change the course of history. That no matter how dark the world may seem, faith and justice will always prevail in the end. And that, in a world full of power and corruption, the quiet strength of a humble man can move mountains. If Zeke's story has touched you, leave a comment below. Share what you've learned from his journey. And if you believe that justice and faith can still change the world, give this video a like and subscribe for more stories of courage and hope. Thank you for watching, and remember, always stand for what's right, no matter the cost. As the echoes of Zeke's humble departure from the courthouse fade into the past, we are left with a powerful question. What would you have done if you were Zeke? Would you have stood up to the powerful forces that sought to silence you? Or would you have walked away, defeated by the overwhelming odds stacked against you? And what about Rosa, the young woman who risked it all to do what was right, who saw the truth when no one else did? Could you have made that same choice? Could you have stood firm in the face of corruption and injustice, knowing that the right thing to do could come at great personal cost? Take a moment and reflect. What would you have done in their shoes? Comment below and share your thoughts. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in the power of faith, justice, and unwavering courage, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe that justice still exists in our world. Zeke Dawson's story is one of redemption, of standing for what's right, no matter the cost. It's a story that reminds us all that no matter how small or insignificant we may feel, God sees everything. And when we act with integrity and faith, the truth will come to light, even if it takes a lifetime. And if you're hungry for more stories of unexpected victories, of people who fought against all odds and emerged victorious, then don't miss our next video. Thank you for watching. And remember, justice may seem far away at times, but as we've seen today, it's always just around the corner. Keep standing for what's right, and may God bless you with strength and courage in every moment. Until next time.